Welcome to the second lecture in Drawing Translation, Drawing the Figure, Scale, Proportion, and Gesture. As the title suggests, we're going to look at how to measure the body visually and learn some essential rules and principles about that, but also think about drawing the figure in a way that is more expressive and is more indicative of what our eyes are doing and trying to record some of that through a variety of different marks on the page. To begin, it's important that you know that the body is not exactly symmetrical, but that the majority of humans fit into a consistent system of ratios, and that it was first theorized by Leonardo da Vinci, who we can see on the right, his famous illustration of the Vitruvian Man, that the human body actually, when sort of fully extended at 45-degree angles, fits into a geometrically perfect circle. From this, other ratios can be derived, such as the arms are the same length from the shoulder joint as the legs are. So if one were to extend their arms fully to the side and measure fingertip to fingertip, it's actually equal to one's height from the heel of the foot to the top of the head. And then we can see other ones that are subsequent. So the knees to the hip joint is roughly a third of the total body minus the head. There's also, as we can see in the illustration on the right, that there are triangles and and obviously rectangles, other basic shapes onto which the body can be mapped. And so if we can pay attention to these and remember them as not stiff, strict rules, but general rules, whenever we go to draw any type of figure, then it makes our job much easier. And now we're going to talk about how to first judge the size of a person through a very particular, but also kind of fun and peculiar means of measurement. Heads. So sometimes, or you may have heard that horses are measured in hands. If you didn't know that, then it's a great little bit of knowledge for trivia night. But humans, when we draw them, are generally measured in heads. And every person is somewhere between 7.5 to 8 heads tall. This is just the way that we as humans have, biologically developed, that our heads are pretty proportionate to the height of our bodies. And so you can see between these, we'll start off with the sketch on the left, that if you break that down further, the shoulders kind of fit into one of those heights of a head, and then we have that down to the elbows, and then down to about the wrists. And from there, we can kind of make these little landmarks. So if we measure the height of the figure in heads, then we also know that, for instance, the knee joints are going to be in between head 6 and 7. And so altogether, from the knee down to the heel of the foot, that represents 2 heads high. And so then we can kind of extrapolate this further and think about width. And the shoulders are 2.5 to 3 heads in width, generally. Again, you're not going to find this to be true every single time, but this is a fairly consistent trait amongst humans. So when we think about the figure, the shoulders, unless they're twisting towards or away from us, are going to be reliably either 2 times the width of the person's head, or up to 3 times that width if they are particularly broad-shouldered or muscular. We can also think about the hips as a vertical divider in the body. Now, a lot of us tend to think of our belly button as the middle of our body, and I've sort of marked that here where that would fall. So that's about 3.5 heads down. And that is our navel. So in that way, in terms of kind of dividing the upper digestive system and the organs in our chest from the rest of our body, that's true. But if we think about it just in terms of visually dividing it in half, it's actually down in the hip joints. And so here at the bottom of 4 heads, then we see that's where the hips connect to the pelvis bone, and that's true whether we're talking about a traditionally male or female body. And generally in this area between 4 and 5 heads, that would be where the legs start. So it doesn't really matter the body type because the skeleton is going to have these same proportions. And then also one final thing that I want you to note too here is that the arms, as I said in the previous slide, are almost the same as your legs in terms of their total length from the joints where they emanate from. So the hands, there's a real tendency to make them much further up and make the arms quite short. But the hands, if you were to extend your fingers down, would touch in the middle of your thighs. So don't make tiny little sort of Tyrannosaurus Rex arms. Just be really embracing of thinking about our arms as these longer things than we usually do. Okay, let's talk about the skull for a minute. So one thing that I see pretty consistently is that people just draw either a circle or an oval for the head, but that's not how our skulls are shaped. And when we draw the figure, we kind of want to look underneath and do a bit of an X-ray vision at first. Even if you're just starting out lightly, with a very light pencil line, it's good to kind of think about the skull and then build on top of it and make it into more, literally flesh it out into a more common representation of the head and face. So here I'm going to show you, kind of with the cursor anyway, what I'm talking about in terms of breaking it up into smaller shapes. So especially from the profile, if we think about the way that the skull is actually shaped anatomically, there are two circular shapes or two what I'm calling ovoid, oval-like shapes. And they intersect like Easter eggs and sort of, they connect somewhere in here around your forehead. And that's really helpful from the profile because just drawing a circle or drawing an oval, you're not going to get that back curvature of the head that slopes down into the neck and then onto the shoulder blades. Instead, you're going to get a circle on a stick. And that's not what we want. So also think about how that translates into a front or a back view where the back of the skull is a different shape. It is quite a bit wider, and then we have the narrowing of the chin or of the nape of the neck down towards the shoulders and the spine. So keep that in mind that the head, when you're rendering it, draw it in two circles, or I should say two ovals that overlap and have more, as you can see, kind of a tapering or a pointiness towards the bottom. After that, when we think about the rest of the spinal column, the torso comprises all three of these parts, but again can be generally divided into thirds before we meet the hip joint. So again, this would be the bottom of roughly head 4, where we see the hip and the pelvis connect. So in this region, we have the upper torso, shoulders and breast and or pectoral muscles, the lower rib cage, keeping in mind that this is usually where there's a natural bend in the body. And then finally, navel and hip crests. So continuing to think about the spine and how it influences the overall pose of the figure, let's think about a backwards S. Now, in the previous slide, I'm going to go back to it for just a minute. This is our backwards S. Notice that it is very thin in profile. So it's not really emphasizing the middle part of the curve, but more so squishing it. But what we have to remember is that this also translates into a kind of inevitable curvature of the body. The body is never completely straight, stiff, and upright. So in this drawing, what we see are mappings, little landmarks of the angles of the joints, showing that they do bend in a kind of gradient, and that inevitably the shoulders and the hip joints will contrast or move in contradiction to one another. So the spine is a naturally curved backward S with less emphasis on the middle of the curve. But most poses do form a curve between the shoulders and the hips. So inevitably, every pose that you draw will have some level of curvature to it. There should be no figure that's depicted with a perfectly straight, ruler sort of straight back. We aren't built that way. We're fleshy creatures, even though we have bones. And so this actually will add to the communication value of your drawing because it immediately makes it seem more lifelike. However, drawing straight lines to map the angles of the joints, especially between the hips and the shoulders, can be really helpful in establishing the basic pose. And we can see that some of this is repeated rhythmically. So the knees are going to be the same, parallel to the hips and the pelvis, as well as the ankles for the ankle joints. And then we can see also, other connections. The angle of the elbow is always going to match the angle of the wrist in terms of a fully extended arm. Of course, if it's bent inward or outward, that will change. But these things stay the same. What you really have to pay attention to is what happens in this, between the upper and the lower torso. The formal name for this inevitable sort of curvature to the body's pose is contrapposto, and it's also important to remember that this is key to showing action and a sense of movement in the figure. So it's actually a very desirable thing to have some bending and some contrasting directions in the pose of your figures that you draw. All right, now let's talk about proportions of the face. So just like the rest of our bodies, the face is fractal, meaning that the same sort of ratios that we see in one part usually can be, rejigged and distributed for the larger portion of anatomy. So a pattern of proportions that we see for the skull and the general size of the head and where different features are positioned also translates into sort of, more microscopic areas, such as proportions of the eye to the eyebrow to the forehead, etc. So let's go through some of these in this image. First of all, a really important one for anyone who is perhaps less experienced with figure drawing is to note that the eyes are in the middle of the head. And what we often don't acknowledge is that the hair covers up the very top of the head. But if you were to remove the hair, this would be very unfortunate for this young girl, but if you were to remove her hair, then you can imagine that if this was just baldness up here, that actually the eyes are all the way, half down in the total size of the head. And this is kind of, bizarre for most of us to think about because we like to think that the eyes are way up top. But that's a key one. Next, in terms of width, the nose is going to take up about the same amount of space as one of the eyes, and these form a kind of rule of thirds in the middle of the face. So the eyes, of course, are going to be slightly further or narrower, least spaced to one another depending on the person, but generally the nose takes up the same amount of width as one of the eyes within its eye socket. Then vertically, we have a kind of division here of halves between the crown, or where the hairline is, down to the middle of the iris in the eye, and then down below the lip into the chin. And then here we see another rule of thirds from the base of the nose down to the split of the lip, down to below the lip and the chin, and then the chin. These can be divided into another series of roughly 3 equal parts. And then finally, with alignment, notice that the eyebrows roughly align with the top of the ears, the bottom of the ears roughly align with the bottom of the nose, and then this is true also vertically between the center of the eye and the crease of the lip. So again, these are general markers, but they prove true for most cases, and especially since you're going to be doing self-portraiture in this model, you can really study your own features, and at least using these as bases, you can come up with your own reliable system of ratios for mapping your own features. Really quickly, I just wanted to deal with the idea of orientation and direction. And also think about the possibility of foreshortening, which is when we see something in extreme perspective, and so the plane that's closest to us, such as the chin in this upper part of the image, becomes or appears to become larger than it would normally appear. And so you can create all kinds of really interesting self-portraits by altering the angle of your face, but young and inexperienced drawers tend to stray away from some of the more complicated perspectives, not because they don't want to draw them, but because there are not a great amount of tools for them in this regard. So I just want to remind you all that because we have these kind of consistent ratios and the different mappings, splitting roughly into thirds and then again into thirds where we see along this sort of center and more or less straight on line of perspectives, that these stay the same. These lines are consistent across all of these faces. What changes is how either further, outward toward the exterior or toward the interior that you place the eyes, the nose, and the mouth, and then also the width, the distance that you give those. So as you move outward, more towards a profile perspective, you shorten the width that you're allowed to place those features into. But where they're positioned on the face stays the same. And that doesn't change when we move either to a sort of an aerial or a sort of worm's eye view from underneath. What changes is the curvature of the lines. So once we're not looking at a straight-on perspective, then much like a cylinder, like a pop can that you would draw, from the top of, looking over and down onto somebody's head and face, then we have an arc that bends downward, and this becomes the same. Again, they stay parallel. So we draw that same arc from the eyebrow to the ear, from the eye to the sort of cochlea or the middle of the ear, from the bottom of the nose to the earlobe, from the split of the lip down to where we would call it the mandible, where the jaw separates. These features stay the same. And what we have to be especially careful about is the distance between these lines and the curvature. So again, if we're looking up at someone from a worm's eye sort of view, then the arc moves upward towards the top rather than arcing downward. So this requires using light, pressure, and kind of doing a pre-sketch that you can build on top of in order to make sure that all of the features are positioned correctly. But it's definitely doable if you take your time and think about this kind of underlying system of lines. Okay, proportions of the hand. Now, hands can be really scary, I realize that. However, they kind of, they're in that same category as faces. So if we think and just break them down into some parallel lines and then arc them and curve them, then it becomes much less scary to draw hands, because all we're doing is making sure that the most severe or emphasized part of the arc is out here towards the middle of the hand, hence the middle finger being the longest. So just some general rules for you. On average, the hand is equal to the size of your face, or about 3/4 of the height of the total head. So if you've ever been subject to one of those awful bullying moments, maybe from a brother or sister, where they say that you have something in your hand when you don't, and then they push it up and slap you in the face, you would probably have realized that your hand is, covers the majority of your face, your eyes, your nose, your mouth. So one of the things that I consistently see is students drawing hands, teeny tiny little sort of crab claw hands on figures. So the hand needs to be just as large as the face, almost the size of the total head. The middle finger is the same length as your entire palm. So the length of this finger is the same length as the palm from wrist to knuckle. And again, that's something that we don't often recognize, but it really is important to making a convincing rendering of a hand. The thumb actually is much longer than we typically think of it too. It extends somewhere along, this bridge of center knuckles, and it's almost as long as the index finger. It's just, further back and down here at the base of the wrist. And then the knuckles and joints follow this series of arcs. So if you're just mindful that you're dealing with a curve rather than a straight line necessarily, then you can almost, the last arc defines the fingertips. Each finger is divided into 3 joints or 3 pieces, and you can work your way back with light lines and then fill this in afterwards. Okay, so as I said at the beginning, In this module, we're thinking about how to render the body actually in a way that you haven't really seen in the past couple of slides. We're not thinking about photorealism here. We're not even thinking about a kind of like high technical quality of illustration. What I want you to focus on in this module is gesture drawing, and this means capturing the figure very quickly, impressionistically, but in every gesture drawing, we can clearly identify that it is a human figure, and we also know what kind of pose or stance they're in, as well as feeling things like weight, volume, energy, and intention. Okay, so here's your basic definition that's actually, this is something I want you to try to commit to memory. So, a quick drawing that captures the essential gesture of the body. Gesture is everywhere. And I don't mean this in a sort of new age spiritual way, but it's embodied in every object, person, and place because that's how we recognize it. Everything has a basic shape, it has a basic direction, it has a basic force that that we feel that it occupies within space. So gesture is all of these different things. It's action, it's emotion, movement, expression, all rolled together into one cohesive sense of motion or movement. So if we look at something like this, it's not important that we know the particular details of this person. It's more about trying to capture the spirit of the body in motion. Even if they're standing what we think is quite still, there is an energy and a presence there. And I also want you to think about the idea of recording your kind of thoughts and paths through mapping the body by actually including more lines than you may want to at first. So here we have a kind of scribbliness that is, yes, it doesn't look precise, it looks a bit messy, but it's actually doing other things. It's creating a sense of mass and volume by showing us the back of the head clearly, and then the same energy is kind of carried forward into the spine, and that emphasizes and really accents the importance of that curvature of the spine and makes it really important as something to understand the overall pose. A couple of other examples for you, and just to iterate that angles in gesture drawing of the body should be exaggerated. Draw in a way that's not unrealistic, but that is in some ways surreal or more real than real, because this helps to communicate the pose very quickly, and it also makes it more visually interesting. So here, I'm not sure that this person was so flexible that they could form this very, lovely arcing back bend, but it's more about over-exaggerating that in order to really communicate the power and the sense of movement and the passage of time within that pose. Here on the right, we see this, and I love these actually. I really encourage you to consider doing something like this. These really broad strokes that are underlying kind of almost like creating a sculpture with an armature where we have basic lines and directions and we build the body and form on top of that. Another great use for gesture drawing is to utilize it as a form of time lapse. So drawing several poses quickly as the figure moves through space. Obviously not so quickly that you can't capture it in time, but what you really come to understand are the micro shifts between angles of the body, and to understand how the basic proportions of the body don't change as they move through space, but rather that they're kind of connected in a sequence of lines and arcs along a pathway. Another thing about this too is that it's a really great opportunity to kind of let yourself go in terms of your mark making and capture some of the sense of time and movement by connective lines, where you don't pick up your pencil, your charcoal, or your whatever your drawing implement is, and let that line be free flowing. So you really are you're tracking the actual movement and the layering of the body through space. So please know and keep in mind as you work through this module that gesture drawing does not have any particular style. I don't have any expectations for what you hand in. I want you to stay true to what feels comfortable for you, but also to push yourself in terms of how you approach drawing, really utilize different weight and pressure in terms of how you apply your implements. Get experimental with how you use the different drawing media that you do in this assignment in order to capture the figure, and let yourself, prioritize more of what you see over what your hand is doing, and feel good in letting yourself relax in that way. Gesture drawing is a chance to explore different visual languages. You can make very different types of gesture drawings. A figural drawing could look completely different from one moment to the next. So if you want to make something very blocky and geometric, and then in the next moment treat the figure very, like fluid, like very watery and curvy, that's up to you. And I would like you, hopefully to use this assignment as a way to explore that and get to know what actually is most interesting and feels comfortable for you. And then lastly, gesture drawing, especially of the figures, should be thought of as a better way to understand how simple graphic forms can really be seen everywhere in the world, that they can help you understand the essential parts of a particular object, the way that it moves through space, the direction, in this case, the figure's pose. So to be able to break it down into simpler shapes of, let's say, like we talked about a little bit earlier, triangles, ovals or ovoids, rectangles, and to be able to translate this then into how you see many other objects in the world, especially for the next module where we're going to look a little bit at still life, this is a very valuable skill. And without getting too precious about it, gesture drawing can help you understand, especially through that urgency and that quickness, how to break something apart into those simple shapes and then bring it back together again on the page.